The thunderous sound of hooves striking the ground caught Abigail Montgomery's attention as she rode toward the Valero ranch. The early morning sun painted the Montana sky with hues of orange and pink, illuminating the vast plains that stretched before her. It was 1876, and the Western Territories were still wild and untamed, much like the spirit that drove her to this moment of reckless determination. She had heard whispers about the magnificent stallion that Dawson Valero had captured from the wild herds roaming the plains near Muskogee Creek. A midnight black Mustang with a splash of white on its chest like a fallen star. They said no man could tame it, not even Valero himself, the most skilled horseman in Gallatin County. That's what had drawn her here at dawn, while the ranch hands were still asleep and the main house stood quiet against the backdrop of the mountains. Abigail dismounted her own mare, a gentle palomino named Sunshine, and tied her securely to a fence post. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the corral where the wild stallion paced. The beast was even more magnificent than the stories described, powerful muscles rippling beneath a coat that gleamed like polished onyx in the morning light. "Hello there, beautiful," she whispered, her breath visible in the cool morning air. The stallion snorted, pawing the ground with obvious distrust. His dark eyes held a wildness that spoke to something deep within Abigail's soul. She understood that feeling all too well, the desire for freedom, the reluctance to be contained. Growing up as the daughter of the town doctor in Bozeman had earned her respect but little understanding. At 22, she should have been married with children already, not sneaking onto a stranger's property to attempt what men twice her size had failed to do. "I'm not here to hurt you," she continued in that same soft voice, slipping between the wooden rails of the corral with practiced ease. Her buckskin trousers and simple cotton shirt allowed her the freedom of movement that would have been impossible in the restrictive dresses her mother insisted were proper for a young lady. The stallion reared, his front hooves slicing through the air in warning. Abigail stood her ground, palms raised to show she carried no rope, no whip, just patience and understanding. "That's not going to work, you know." The deep voice startled her so badly she nearly jumped out of her skin. Turning slowly, Abigail found herself facing a tall figure silhouetted against the rising sun. Even before she could make out his features, she knew exactly who it was. Dawson Valero stepped into the corral, closing the gate behind him with a decisive click. At 28, he'd already established himself as one of the most successful ranchers in the territory. Stories of his skill with horses were matched only by tales of his stubborn pride and fierce independence. "Mr. Valero," she acknowledged, straightening her spine and refusing to show the fear bubbling in her stomach. "I can explain. Can you?" His voice was low and measured, but she caught the dangerous edge to it. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're trespassing on my land and messing with my horse." Dawn light revealed his features more clearly now, strong jaw darkened with stubble, eyes the color of a summer storm, and dark hair that curled slightly where it brushed his collar. He wore no coat despite the morning chill, just a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to expose tanned, muscular forearms. "I heard no one could break him," Abigail said, gesturing to the stallion who now watched them both with wary interest. "I thought I'd try a different approach." Dawson's eyebrow arched. "By sneaking onto my property at dawn, most folks would call that theft." "I wasn't stealing him," she protested. "I was consulting." To her surprise, a hint of amusement flickered across his face before disappearing behind that stern mask once more. "Consulting," he repeated flatly. "And do you often offer your horse-breaking expertise to ranchers who haven't asked for it, Miss Montgomery, Abigail Montgomery?" Recognition dawned in his eyes. Doc Montgomery's daughter. The one who, yes, the one who rides astride and wears trousers, she interrupted, having heard the whispers herself. The scandal of Bozeman society. Dawson studied her for a long moment, then turned his attention to the stallion, who had calmed somewhat but still maintained a cautious distance. "You got closer to him than anyone else has," he admitted grudgingly. "How'd you do that?" Abigail relaxed slightly, sensing the conversation had shifted away from potential legal consequences. "I didn't bring anything that might threaten him. No ropes, no saddle, just myself. Mighty brave." "Or foolish." Dawson moved slowly toward the center of the corral. "This stallion's thrown 3 men, broke Jim Harker's leg last week. Because they tried to dominate him," she said, following Dawson's movements with her eyes. "He's not the kind to submit to force." Something unreadable flashed in Dawson's eyes. "And what kind is he? The kind that needs to choose you back?" The stallion huffed, circling the corral but keeping both humans in sight. Abigail took a slow step forward, then another, speaking in that same soft, melodic voice she'd used before Dawson's arrival. To her satisfaction, the horse didn't retreat. "See," she said quietly. "He's curious." "He's dangerous," Dawson countered, but there was less certainty in his tone now. He watched as she continued her careful approach, never making sudden movements, always giving the stallion space to retreat if he wished. "What would you have done if he'd charged you?" Dawson asked, genuine curiosity in his voice now. "Gotten out of his way," she replied simply. "Respectfully." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Respectfully trampled. Better than disrespectfully conquering." The stallion allowed her within arm's reach now, his nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. Abigail stood perfectly still, letting him make the decision to close the final distance between them. When he stretched his neck and nudged her shoulder with his muzzle, triumph surged through her veins. "Well, I'll be damned," Dawson murmured, the awe in his voice unmistakable. Abigail gently stroked the stallion's neck, feeling the powerful muscles quivering beneath her touch. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the wildest things just need to be understood, not broken." "You've already broken something wilder," Dawson said, his voice strange and quiet. When she turned to him with a questioning look, he clarified, "My certainty that no one could get near that horse." But something in his expression told her he might have meant something else entirely. The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken thoughts. Then Dawson cleared his throat. "Sun's up. My men will be starting their day soon. You should probably go before anyone starts asking questions about why Doc Montgomery's daughter is in my corral at dawn." Reality crashed back, reminding Abigail of her precarious position. "Are you going to tell my father?" Dawson considered this, tilting his head slightly. "Tell him what? That his daughter has a gift with horses that most men would envy." Relief flooded through her. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet." He gestured toward the stallion, who still stood calmly under Abigail's gentle touch. "You started something here. I expect you to finish it." She blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Miss Montgomery, that I'm offering you a job." His eyes held a challenge. "Unless you were just consulting for the thrill of trespassing." "A job," she echoed, momentarily speechless. "Breaking your horse." "Breaking this one, yes, and maybe helping with others." He shrugged, an attempt at casualness that didn't quite succeed. "I've got 15 more that could use a gentler touch than my men seem capable of." The offer was unexpected and tempting. Working with horses was all she had ever wanted, but no one had ever taken her seriously before. "My father expects me to help in his practice," she said slowly. "He wants me to marry Dr. Henderson's son by Christmas." Something darkened in Dawson's expression. "And what do you want, Miss Montgomery?" The question hit her like a physical blow. No one had asked her that before, not her father, not her mother, not the parade of suitable young men who called it their home with flowers and rehearsed compliments. She looked back at the stallion, who now rested his head against her shoulder in a gesture of surprising trust. "I want this," she said simply. "I want to work with horses who need understanding." Dawson nodded once, decisively. "Then be here tomorrow at the same time. We'll work out the details before the ranch wakes up." He paused, then added, "And use the main gate next time. No more sneaking in like a horse thief." "I wasn't," she began to protest, but the amused glint in his eye stopped her. "Fine. The main gate." As Dawson unlatched the corral gate to let her out, their hands briefly touched, a fleeting contact that nonetheless sent an unexpected warmth spreading up her arm. He pulled back quickly, his expression unreadable once more. "Tomorrow, Miss Montgomery," he said, his voice gruff. "Tomorrow, Mr. Valero," she replied, already wondering how she would explain her early morning rides to her increasingly suspicious parents. As she mounted Sunshine and rode away, she could feel his eyes following her. The wild stallion had accepted her touch, but something told her that Dawson Valero might prove to be the more untamable of the two. The sun was halfway to its zenith when Abigail returned home, slipping through the back door of her family's stately two-story house on the edge of Bozeman. She had hoped to change before anyone noticed her absence, but her mother's voice stopped her at the foot of the stairs. "Riding again, Abigail?" Elizabeth Montgomery appeared in the doorway of the parlor, her perfectly arranged hair and impeccable dress making Abigail acutely aware of her own disheveled appearance. "Just a morning ride, Mother. The air clears my mind." A lady's mind should be clear enough without galloping through the countryside at indecent hours. Her mother's disapproving gaze traveled from Abigail's practical boots to the trousers that had scandalized half of Bozeman society. "And in such attire." "I can hardly ride properly in a dress," Abigail pointed out, knowing the argument was futile but unable to stop herself. "You shouldn't be riding properly at all. Side saddle is the only acceptable way for a woman of your standing." Elizabeth sighed deeply. "Your father and I have been patient, Abigail, but you're 22 now. It's time to set aside these childish pursuits." Abigail bit her tongue to keep from pointing out that breaking wild horses was hardly childish. "Where is father?" she asked instead, changing the subject. "Called to the Jenkins farm. Their youngest has a fever." Elizabeth smoothed her already immaculate skirts. "Which reminds me, Andrew Henderson will be joining us for dinner tonight. I expect you to be presentable and agreeable." Andrew Henderson. The thought of spending an evening listening to the young doctor's self-important monologues made her stomach turn. But tonight would be a perfect opportunity to gauge her father's reaction to her potential employment. "Of course, Mother," she said with a docility that made Elizabeth's eyes narrow in suspicion. "I mean it, Abigail. No talk of horses or that ridiculous notion of becoming a veterinarian. No proper lady would consider such a profession." "Yes, Mother." She started up the stairs, eager to escape further scrutiny. "I'll be presentable, I promise." Once in the privacy of her room, Abigail leaned against the closed door and closed her eyes. The memory of that morning felt like a dream, the magnificent stallion accepting her touch, Dawson Valero's storm-gray eyes watching her with a mixture of disbelief, and something else she couldn't quite name, something that had made her breath catch. She pushed away from the door and began changing into more appropriate attire for a day spent helping her mother with household matters. As she buttoned the high collar of her sensible day dress, she found herself wondering what Dawson was doing now. Was he telling his ranch hands about the strange woman who had managed to touch the untouchable stallion? Was he regretting his impulsive job offer, By the time evening arrived, Abigail had nearly convinced herself that Dawson would have come to his senses. No respectable rancher would hire a woman to break horses, especially not one from a prominent family. She had probably imagined the entire exchange in the heat of the moment. These thoughts occupied her mind as she mechanically responded to Andrew Henderson's attempts at conversation over dinner. At 26, Andrew had already established himself as her father's protege and presumptive son-in-law, despite the fact that no formal arrangement had been made. His pale blue eyes, carefully combed blonde hair, and precise mannerisms couldn't have been more different from Dawson Valero's wild, dark curls and weathered intensity. "I've been considering expanding my practice," Andrew was saying, directing his comments more to her father than to Abigail. "Perhaps taking on an assistant." Robert Montgomery nodded approvingly. "A wise decision. The territory is growing rapidly." "Indeed." Andrew dabbed at his mouth with his napkin. "And I've been thinking it might be time to establish a more permanent situation." His gaze slid to Abigail meaningfully. Her father cleared his throat. "Well now, there's a thought to consider carefully." "I believe I've given it ample consideration, sir." Andrew straightened in his chair. "In fact, with your permission, I'd like to speak with Abigail privately after dinner." The tension in the room was palpable. Elizabeth beamed with barely concealed delight, while Robert looked both pleased and slightly wistful. Abigail felt as though the walls were closing in around her. "Actually," she said, surprising herself with her steady voice, "I've been offered a position that I'm considering." 3 pairs of eyes turned to her in varying degrees of shock. "A position?" her father repeated, confusion evident. "What sort of position?" Abigail took a deep breath. "Working with horses at the Valero ranch." The stunned silence that followed was broken by Andrew's incredulous laugh. "You can't be serious, Abigail." "I'm perfectly serious." She met his gaze steadily. "Mr. Valero has offered me employment breaking and training horses that require a gentler approach." Elizabeth's face had gone pale. "Absolutely not. It's out of the question." "How do you even know Dawson Valero?" her father asked, his brow furrowed. "When did this happen?" "This morning," Abigail admitted. "I heard about a stallion he was having trouble with, and I went to see if I could help." "You went to his ranch, alone?" Robert's voice rose slightly. "Abigail, do you have any idea what people would say if they knew?" "I don't care what people say," she replied, though that wasn't entirely true. She did care, but not enough to sacrifice her own dreams. "I have a gift with horses, father. You know that. This is a chance to use it." Andrew set down his fork with deliberate care. "Abigail, a woman of your standing cannot possibly work as a common horsebreaker. It's unseemly, not to mention dangerous." "I agree," Elizabeth said firmly. "Robert, you must forbid this nonsense immediately." Her father studied her face for a long moment. Unlike her mother and Andrew, he didn't immediately dismiss the idea, which gave Abigail a flicker of hope. "Dawson Valero has a reputation for fairness," he said slowly, "but also for being something of a lone wolf, not the sort of man who hires women for ranch work." "He saw what I could do," Abigail explained, leaning forward earnestly. "The stallion that threw 3 of his men and broke Jim Harker's leg, I was able to approach him, to touch him." Robert's eyebrows rose. "That black devil that nearly killed Todd Wilson last month," she nodded eagerly. "That's the one. Father, Mr. Valero offered me fair wages to work with that horse and others that need similar handling." "Out of the question," Elizabeth repeated, her voice sharp with finality. "Robert, tell her." Her father sighed deeply, looking suddenly older than his 50 years. "Your mother's right, Abigail. A young woman working alone at a ranch full of men, it would ruin your reputation, and it's dangerous work." "But no." Robert's tone grew firm. I understand your love for horses, truly I do, but this is not an appropriate position for Dr. Montgomery's daughter. Abigail felt a surge of rebellion so strong it nearly choked her. And what is appropriate? Marrying Andrew and spending my life pouring tea and hosting dinners while my mind withers away. Andrew's face flushed red. That's hardly fair, Abigail. As my wife, you would have many important duties. As your helpmate, she finished bitterly. Always in your shadow, never allowed to pursue my own interests. Abigail, Elizabeth gasped, apologized to Andrew at once. But Abigail was already pushing back her chair and standing. "Excuse me," she said stiffly. "I find I've lost my appetite." She fled to her room before tears could betray her in front of Andrew's judgmental gaze. Once alone, she paced the floor like a caged animal, her mind racing. They couldn't stop her. She was 22, old enough to make her own decisions, even if society frowned upon women who exercised such independence. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Abigail," her father's voice called. "May I come in?" She wiped her eyes hastily. "Yes." Robert entered, closing the door behind him. His kind face was troubled as he regarded his headstrong daughter. "Andrew has gone home," he said gently, "though I doubt he's abandoned his intentions." Abigail sat heavily on the edge of her bed. "I cannot marry him, Father." "Please don't ask that of me." "Is it so terrible a prospect?" He sat beside her. "Andrew is a good man, steady, respectable. He would provide well for you." "I don't doubt that," she admitted, "but we want different things from life." "He wants a wife who will support his ambitions and raise his children. I want—" She struggled to articulate the restlessness that had always lived inside her. "More," Robert sighed. "This position at the Valero ranch, it's not the answer, Abigail. Even if I approved, which I don't, what then? You work there for a time, and then what? No respectable man would marry a woman who's lived among ranch hands." "Maybe I don't want to marry a respectable man," she countered. "Maybe I want someone who sees me as more than an ornament or a convenient helpmate." Her father studied her face, his expression softening. "You're so like your grandmother. She had that same fire." He patted her hand. "Give yourself time, Abigail. The right match will come along, someone who appreciates your spirit rather than trying to tame it." But as her father left her to her thoughts, Abigail knew her decision was already made. Tomorrow morning, she would return to the Valero ranch. She would accept Dawson's offer, regardless of her parents' disapproval. For once in her life, she would choose her own path. The pre-dawn sky was still sprinkled with stars when Abigail slipped from her house the next morning. She had barely slept, her mind cycling between determination and doubt. What if Dawson had reconsidered? What if his offer had been made in the heat of the moment, never meant to be taken seriously? These questions plagued her as she rode toward the Valero ranch, the rolling landscape gradually revealing itself in the growing light. This time, she approached the main gate as instructed, but hesitated before entering. The ranch was larger than she had realized from her covert approach the previous day, a sprawling complex of corrals, barns, bunkhouses, and a two-story main house that spoke of considerable prosperity. Just as she was gathering her courage to announce herself, she spotted Dawson emerging from the largest barn. He paused when he saw her, then approached with that same measured stride she remembered from yesterday. "You came," he said, opening the gate for her. It wasn't quite a question, but she detected a note of surprise in his voice. "I said I would," she replied, dismounting Sunshine with practiced ease. "Most people say a lot of things they don't mean." He took Sunshine's reins, his fingers brushing against hers in that same electric contact as before. Especially when they're caught trespassing. Despite her nervousness, Abigail found herself smiling. "I wasn't trespassing. I was consulting, remember, A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Right. Consulting. He gestured toward the barn. The stallion's inside. Thought you might prefer to work with him away from prying eyes, at least at first. The consideration behind this gesture wasn't lost on Abigail. Thank you. My father doesn't exactly approve of this arrangement. Dawson's expression grew serious. I figured as much. Doc Montgomery's a respected man. Can't imagine he's thrilled about his daughter working at her ranch. He's not. She followed him toward the barn, leading Sunshine. But I'm old enough to make my own decisions. Are you? He glanced back at her, those storm-gray eyes suddenly penetrating. Most unmarried women your age still answer to their fathers. I'm not most women. No, he agreed quietly. You're not. Inside the barn, the black stallion occupied a spacious stall larger than the others. He snorted when he saw them, ears pricking forward with what Abigail thought might be recognition. He remembers me, she said with satisfaction. Seems so. Dawson leaned against a post, arms crossed over his chest. I've been thinking about your approach yesterday, never seen anything like it. My grandmother taught me, Abigail explained, moving closer to the stall. She grew up among the Blackfeet. They have a different way with horses, more partnership than domination. Your grandmother lived with Indians. There was no judgment in his voice, just curiosity. Abigail nodded, her attention still on the stallion. She was captured as a girl during a raid but ended up staying willingly, married a warrior named Running Elk. My grandfather, the one everyone in Bozeman thinks, was my grandmother's husband, actually found her years later and brought her back to civilization. She never quite readjusted. Sounds like someone else I'm beginning to know, Dawson observed wryly. She glanced at him, surprised by the perceptiveness of his comment. I suppose so. She taught me that horses respond to our energy more than our actions. If you approach with fear or aggression, that's what you'll receive in return. And if you approach with respect, then sometimes, even the wildest spirit will meet you halfway. She unlatched the stall door and slipped inside, moving slowly and deliberately as she had the day before. The stallion regarded her warily, but with less suspicion than during their first encounter. Abigail began speaking softly, not so much concerned with the words as with maintaining a calm, steady tone. Gradually, she moved closer until she could once again touch his powerful neck. What will you call him? Dawson asked after several minutes of watching this quiet communion. Abigail considered the question, running her hand along the stallion's sleek flank. Midnight, she decided, for his color, though that white mark on his chest reminds me of a fallen star. Midnight it is. Dawson stepped closer to the stall. Think you can saddle him today? No. Her answer was immediate and confident. He's not ready. It might take weeks before he accepts a saddle without fear. She expected an argument. Ranch work operated on tight schedules, after all, but Dawson merely nodded. Then weeks it is. But we need to discuss terms if you're serious about this position. I am. She gave Midnight a final pat before exiting the stall, careful to secure the latch behind her. $3 a week, Dawson offered, plus meals when you're here. You'd work mainly with Midnight at first, but I've got others that could use your touch if this goes well. It was a fair wage, more than fair for a woman in 1876. I accept, she said without hesitation. Good. He extended his hand, and she took it, feeling calluses that spoke of years of hard work. Now for the difficult part, which is convincing my foreman that I haven't lost my mind. Dawson's expression was unreadable. And figuring out how to protect your reputation while you're working here. The practical concern caught her off guard. I hadn't considered that. I have. He released her hand. You'll need a chaperone, someone respectable who can vouch for your honor. Abigail almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Mr. Valero, no respectable woman in Bozeman would agree to chaperone me while I break horses. Then we'll have to find someone who isn't from Bozeman. He seemed to be working through a problem in his mind. My sister arrives from St. Louis next week. She's coming to keep house for me after my housekeeper retired. Caroline's a widow, about 30, with ideas nearly as progressive as yours. Would that satisfy propriety? The solution was elegant in its simplicity. With a respectable female presence at the ranch, Abigail's time there could be explained as social visits combined with her interest in horses. It wouldn't silence all gossip, but it would provide a veneer of acceptability. That might work, she agreed. But what about until then? Dawson considered this. Come at dawn like today. Be gone by the time the hands have breakfast. We'll keep this between us until Caroline arrives. The clandestine arrangement sent a thrill of both excitement and trepidation through her. My parents will still object, probably. His gaze was steady. You sure this is worth fighting that battle, Miss Montgomery? The question carried weight beyond the immediate situation. Was her independence worth the social cost? Worth potentially alienating her family? Worth the whispers that would inevitably follow? Abigail looked back at Midnight, who watched them with intelligent, wary eyes. She thought of all the horses she might help, all the skills she could develop. And perhaps, in a corner of her mind she wasn't ready to examine too closely, she thought of dawn hours spent in the company of this enigmatic man whose gray eyes seemed to see beyond her carefully constructed facade. Yes, she said firmly, it's worth it. Something that might have been respect flickered across Dawson's face. Then I'll see you tomorrow at dawn, and Miss Montgomery? Yes, wear those trousers. They're much more practical for the work, she laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet barn. I wouldn't dream of wearing anything else, Mr. Valero. As the sun cleared the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Abigail knew she should leave before the ranch fully awakened. Yet she lingered, reluctant to end this stolen morning that felt like the first page of a new chapter in her life. I should go, she finally said, leading Sunshine from the barn. Dawson nodded, his expression unreadable once more. Until tomorrow, then. Until tomorrow. She mounted her horse and turned toward home, feeling his eyes on her back long after she'd passed through the main gate. For the first time in her 22 years, Abigail Montgomery was charting her own course. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with obstacles both seen and unseen. But as she rode through the golden Montana morning, one thought sustained her. Tomorrow would come, and with it, another chance to tame what others considered untamable. Over the next week, Abigail settled into a rhythm of pre-dawn rides to the Valero ranch, hours spent with Midnight, and returns home before her absence became suspicious. Each morning, she made progress with the stallion, gradually introducing him to the weight of a blanket on his back, then a light saddle. Dawson observed these sessions with an intensity that both unnerved and exhilarated her. He trusts you completely, he remarked on the 5th morning, leaning against the corral fence as Abigail led Midnight in circles, the saddle now secure on his back though no one had yet attempted to ride him. Not completely, she corrected. But we're building understanding. Trust will follow. Dawson's gaze shifted from the horse to her face. Is that how it works with people too? The question caught her off guard. During their mornings together, they had discussed horses, ranch operations, and occasionally exchanged stories about their vastly different upbringings. But they had carefully avoided anything that might be construed as personal interest. Sometimes, she answered carefully, though people are more complicated than horses. Are they? He pushed away from the fence, moving closer. Seems to me both respond to honesty and consistent treatment. Perhaps, She continued leading midnight, aware of Dawson's proximity in a way that made her pulse quicken. But people have expectations, assumptions, and you don't like living up to others' expectations. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. Not when those expectations require me to be less than I am. He nodded, as though she had confirmed something he already suspected. My sister arrives tomorrow, he said, changing the subject. You should meet her properly. Come for supper. Abigail halted, surprised by the invitation. Supper? Here. Unless you'd prefer to continue these clandestine dawn meetings indefinitely. There was that hint of amusement in his voice again. No, She gathered her thoughts. Supper would be fine, but what should I tell my parents? Dawson shrugged. The truth or part of it? That you've been invited to dine with Dawson Valero and his recently arrived sister. It's a perfectly respectable social engagement. Put that way, it seemed simple enough. Yet Abigail knew her mother would immediately suspect matchmaking intentions, which would lead to complicated explanations about her true purpose at the ranch. I'll try, she promised, unsure how the conversation with her parents would unfold. That evening, seated in the parlor after dinner, Abigail broached the subject as casually as she could. I've received an invitation to dine at the Valero Ranch tomorrow evening, she said, keeping her gaze fixed on the embroidery in her lap. Her mother looked up sharply from her own needlework. The Valero Ranch. Whatever for? Mr. Valero's sister has just arrived from St. Louis. I believe he's trying to introduce her to suitable company in the area. The fabrication came more easily than she'd expected. Her father lowered his newspaper, regarding her over his reading glasses. I didn't realize you were acquainted with Dawson Valero. Abigail chose her words carefully. We've met several times in town. He mentioned his sister was coming to keep house for him, and he's been kind enough to let me visit his stables occasionally. He knows of my interest in horses. This much was true, if incomplete. She held her breath, waiting for more probing questions. Elizabeth exchanged a glance with her husband. Well, the Valeros are a respectable family, despite Dawson's unconventional ways. And I suppose it would be good for you to form a friendship with his sister. She must be quite lonely, arriving in a new place. Robert nodded slowly. Caroline Valero was Caroline Mitchell before her marriage, if I recall correctly. Her husband was a banker who died in that influenza outbreak a few years back. Left her well provided for. You seem remarkably well informed about the Valeros' father, Abigail observed, trying to keep her tone light. A doctor knows most everyone's business one way or another. He folded his newspaper. I have no objection to your dining there, provided Mrs. Valero is indeed present as chaperone. Relief washed over Abigail. Thank you. I've heard she's quite accomplished, educated at a ladies' seminary in Boston. Then perhaps she'll be a positive influence, Elizabeth said pointedly. Heaven knows you could use some refinement in your social graces. Abigail bit back a sharp retort, reminding herself that securing permission to visit the ranch openly was worth enduring her mother's criticisms. I'll wear my blue silk, she promised, knowing this concession to femininity would please her mother. Elizabeth nodded approvingly. And I'll have Martha arrange your hair properly. First impressions are so important. As her parents discussed appropriate attire and social etiquette for the dinner, Abigail's thoughts drifted to Dawson. Would he find her changed in formal dinner attire? Would he prefer the proper young lady in silk and lace to the determined horsebreaker in practical trousers? The question bothered her more than it should have. The following evening, Abigail found herself seated in the Valero's comfortable dining room, feeling both overdressed and oddly vulnerable in her formal attire. The ranch house was surprisingly refined inside, solid furniture of good quality, paintings on the walls, a piano in the corner of the parlor. It spoke of wealth acquired through hard work rather than inheritance. Caroline Valero proved to be exactly as Dawson had described: intelligent, progressive in her thinking, and possessed of a dry wit that immediately put Abigail at ease. At 30, she retained a youthful beauty tempered by the wisdom of experience. Her dark hair and gray eyes marked her unmistakably as Dawson's sister, though her features were softer, more conventionally feminine. "My brother tells me you have quite a way with horses," Caroline remarked as they enjoyed a well-prepared roast beef dinner. "Especially that black terror he's been trying to break for weeks." Abigail glanced at Dawson, who was watching her with unreadable eyes. She had barely recognized him when she arrived, dressed as he was in a proper suit rather than his usual ranch attire. The formal clothes emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame. "I've had some success with Midnight," she admitted, "but we still have a long way to go." "Midnight?" Caroline raised an eyebrow. "You've named him already." "A horse needs a name befitting its character," Dawson interjected. Miss Montgomery felt Midnight captured his essence. "Because of his color," Abigail explained, "and the white mark on his chest that looks like a fallen star." Caroline smiled knowingly. "How poetic." "Dawson usually gives his horses practical names like Brownie or Spot." "That's not true," Dawson protested. "My mare is named Calliope." "After I insisted Brown Horse was not a proper name for such a beautiful animal," his sister countered, laughing. Abigail found herself laughing along, charmed by the easy banter between the siblings. It was a side of Dawson she hadn't seen before: relaxed, almost playful, so different from the intense, reserved man who watched her work with Midnight each morning. "Dawson mentioned you might be willing to act as chaperone while I work with the horses," she said to Caroline as the meal progressed. "I understand if it's an imposition." "Not at all," Caroline interrupted, her expression warm. "In fact, I'd be delighted." St. Louis society was stifling in its expectations of proper widowhood. "I came west partly to escape those constraints." "Caroline has always been the rebel in the family," Dawson remarked, a hint of pride in his voice. "Not compared to you," his sister countered. Running away at 16 to join a cattle drive. This was new information, and Abigail looked at Dawson with fresh curiosity. "You ran away?" He shifted slightly, seeming uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Our father had different plans for my future. I had my own ideas." "Father wanted him to study law in Boston," Caroline explained. "Follow the proper Valero tradition of respectability and social advancement." Dawson preferred horses and open skies. "Can't imagine why," Dawson said dryly, but there was an underlying tension in his voice that suggested the rift with his father ran deeper than this light explanation implied. Caroline seemed to sense she touched on sensitive ground. "In any case," she continued smoothly, "I'm more than happy to provide the appearance of propriety while you pursue your interests, Abigail. May I call you Abigail, of course?" She smiled, genuinely pleased by Caroline's easy acceptance. "And thank you. It means more than you know." "Oh, I think I understand perfectly." Caroline's gaze moved between Abigail and her brother. "Sometimes we need someone to hold the door open while we find our own path." After dinner, Dawson suggested a tour of the house for Abigail while Caroline arranged coffee in the parlor. As they moved through the comfortable rooms, Abigail was struck by how the home reflected its owner: practical yet unexpectedly refined, with surprising touches of beauty amid functionality. "Your sister is wonderful," she said as they paused in a small library lined with well-used books. "She is." Dawson's voice held genuine affection. "Though I should warn you she has a tendency to meddle in matters that don't concern her." "Such as?" He hesitated, then said simply, "People's hearts." The statement hung in the air between them, charged with unspoken implications. Abigail became acutely aware of their solitude, of the way the lamplight cast shadows across Dawson's strong features, softening their usual severity. "I should be able to handle midnight on my own soon," she said, desperate to break the sudden tension. "Another week, perhaps two. And then—" His gaze was intent, searching. "And then I'll move on to the other horses you mentioned." She ran her fingers along the spine of a leather-bound volume, avoiding his eyes. "That was our agreement." "It was." He took a step closer. "Abigail." The sound of her name on his lips, the first time he had used it, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the evening chill. "Yes," she managed, finally looking up to meet his gaze. Whatever he might have said was interrupted by Caroline's voice calling from the parlor. "Coffee's ready, and I've found some of Mother's almond cookies in the pantry." The moment shattered. Dawson stepped back, his expression once again carefully controlled. "We should join her," he said, his voice neutral. "Yes, of course." Abigail preceded him from the library, her mind whirling with questions about what might have happened if Caroline hadn't called when she did. Later, as Dawson helped her into her father's carriage that had arrived to take her home, their hands touched briefly. "Tomorrow morning?" he asked quietly so the driver couldn't hear. "Tomorrow morning," she confirmed, equally soft. "Though I suppose I can come at a more reasonable hour now." His lips curved in that almost smile she was beginning to treasure. "Dawn suits you, Miss Montgomery. The light catches in your hair." Before she could respond to this unexpected poetic observation, he closed the carriage door and stepped back, a proper gentleman bidding good night to a dinner guest. But as the carriage pulled away, Abigail knew that something fundamental had shifted between them, something that went far beyond their professional arrangement. The following weeks established a new pattern. Abigail rode to the Valero ranch each morning, spending hours with Midnight and the other horses that needed gentling. Caroline often joined her, proving to be both good company and a quick study in Abigail's methods. "I've never seen anything like it," Caroline remarked one morning as they watched Midnight canter around the corral, responding to Abigail's subtle signals with remarkable precision. "Most men would have broken his spirit by now." "That's exactly what I didn't want to happen," Abigail explained, leaning against the fence. "He's magnificent because of his spirit, not despite it." Caroline studied her thoughtfully. "You know, you remind me of my brother in some ways." "Do I?" The comparison surprised her. "MMM. Both stubborn as mules, both determined to do things your own way." Caroline smiled to soften her words. "And both hiding tender hearts behind walls of independence." Abigail fidgeted under this perceptive assessment. "I wouldn't say I'm hiding anything." "No." Caroline's expression was knowing. "Then you've been completely honest with your parents about the extent of your work here, and about your feelings for my brother." Heat rushed to Abigail's cheeks. "I mean, Mr. Valero is my employer, nothing more. Of course." Caroline's tone made it clear she didn't believe this for a moment. "And the way he watches you when you're working with the horses, that's merely professional interest." Abigail had noticed those watchful gazes, too, the intensity in Dawson's eyes when she demonstrated a technique, the way his expression softened when she spoke passionately about her methods. But she had attributed it to respect for her skills, nothing more personal. "Your brother appreciates good horsemanship," she said carefully. Caroline laughed. "My brother appreciates you, Abigail Montgomery, but he's as stubborn about admitting his feelings as you are." Before Abigail could formulate a response, Dawson himself appeared, leading a skittish bay mare toward the corral. "Ladies," he greeted them, tipping his hat. "Discussing state secrets." Just horse talk, Caroline replied innocently. And I was just telling Abigail she should join us for Sunday dinner this week. Her parents too, of course. This was news to both Abigail and Dawson, judging by his startled expression. "You've invited the Montgomerys to dinner?" he asked his sister. "I'm about to." Caroline smiled serenely. "It's only proper, considering how much time Abigail spends here. And I think it's time her parents understood exactly what she's accomplishing." The logic was sound, but Abigail's stomach twisted with apprehension. Her parents knew she visited the ranch regularly, but they still believed it was primarily social calls on Caroline, with occasional time spent observing the horses. They had no idea she was actively working as a horsebreaker, earning wages for her skills. "I'm not sure that's wise," she began, but Caroline waved away her concern. "Trust me, Abigail. Sometimes the direct approach is best. Besides, your father respects Dawson, and once they see what you've accomplished with Midnight, they'll understand why this matters to you." Dawson looked equally uncertain. "Caroline, maybe we should. It's decided," his sister interrupted firmly. "Sunday at 2 o'clock. I'll send a proper invitation tomorrow." With that, she excused herself to attend to household matters, leaving Abigail and Dawson alone by the corral. "Your sister is formidable," Abigail observed after a moment of stunned silence. "You have no idea." Dawson sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of agitation. "Look, if you'd rather not go through with this dinner—" "No, she's right," Abigail interrupted, surprising herself with the realization. "It's time my parents understood. I'm tired of half-truths and evasions." He studied her face. "Even if they disapprove, even if they forbid you from returning." The possibility had haunted her for weeks. "I'm 22, she said with more confidence than she felt. "They can't forbid me anything, can't they?" His expression was skeptical. "Society has powerful ways of enforcing its rules, Abigail, especially for women." "Then society will have to adapt," she replied, lifting her chin defiantly. "Because I won't go back to being the proper doctor's daughter whose only purpose is to make an advantageous marriage." Something flickered in Dawson's eyes, admiration mixed with concern. "Your courage is remarkable," he said softly, "but I worry about the cost to you." His concern touched her deeply. "Some things are worth the cost." Their gazes held for a long moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Then Dawson cleared his throat and gestured to the bay mare. "Enough serious talk. Pearl here has been refusing the saddle for 3 days. Want to show me how your methods might help?" Grateful for the return to familiar ground, Abigail turned her attention to the nervous mare. Yet as she worked, demonstrating the gentle approach that had proven so effective with Midnight, she remained acutely aware of Dawson's presence, his attentive gaze, his thoughtful questions, and the way his hand occasionally brushed hers as they worked together with the horse. Caroline was right about one thing. Whatever was developing between them went far beyond employer and employee. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a crisp autumn breeze that hinted at the coming winter. Abigail spent extra time with her appearance, choosing a dress that balanced propriety with practicality, a sage green wool that complemented her eyes, and allowed for movement if she needed to demonstrate her work with the horses. Her parents had accepted Caroline's invitation with some surprise, but no suspicion. Elizabeth was particularly pleased by the social connection, viewing it as evidence that her daughter was finally developing appropriate relationships. Caroline Valero moves in the best circles in St. Louis, I'm told, she remarked as their carriage approached the ranch. And while Dawson has always been somewhat Unconventional, the Valeros are an old family with excellent connections. Abigail exchanged a glance with her father, who seemed amused by his wife's transparent calculations. "I'm sure the dinner will be delightful regardless of the Valeros' social standing, my dear," he said mildly. Of course, of course." Elizabeth straightened her already impeccable bonnet. "But it never hurts to cultivate beneficial acquaintances. Beneficial acquaintances." If only her mother knew the true nature of her acquaintance with Dawson Valero. The thought brought both guilt and a secret thrill of defiance. Caroline greeted them at the door with perfect hospitality, ushering them into the parlor where Dawson waited. He looked different again today, not the rugged rancher Abigail worked alongside each morning, nor the formal gentleman from their first dinner, but something in between. His dark hair was neatly combed, his suit well-tailored but not ostentatious. He looked, she thought with some surprise, like a man who belonged in both world society and wilderness. "Dr. Montgomery, Mrs. Montgomery." He shook her father's hand and bowed slightly to her mother. "Thank you for joining us today. Mr. Valero." Robert's handshake was firm. "Your sister's invitation was most welcome. I've been curious about this ranch of yours for some time." "Then perhaps after dinner you'd allow me to show you around," Dawson suggested. "I'm particularly proud of our breeding program. I'd enjoy that." Her father's genuine interest was evident. Dinner proceeded pleasantly enough, with Caroline proving herself a charming hostess, and the conversation flowing easily between topics of local interest, developments in the territory, and memories of the East that both Caroline and Elizabeth shared. Abigail remained quieter than usual, waiting for the inevitable moment when the true purpose of the gathering would be revealed. It came as they were finishing the main course. Caroline set down her fork and smiled at Elizabeth. "Mrs. Montgomery, I must tell you how impressed I've been with your daughter's skills with horses. She has a remarkable gift." Elizabeth accepted this as simple flattery. Abigail has always been fond of riding, a bit too fond, perhaps, for a young lady. "Oh, it goes far beyond riding," Caroline continued smoothly. "She has a way of communicating with even the most difficult animals. Dawson's prized stallion, for instance, no one could get near him until Abigail." Robert looked at his daughter with surprise. "Is that true, Abigail?" "You've been working with Mr. Valero's horses." The moment of truth had arrived. Abigail took a deep breath. "Yes, father. For several weeks now, Mr. Valero has employed me to gentle some of his more challenging horses." "Employed you?" Elizabeth repeated, her voice rising slightly. "What do you mean, employed?" Dawson intervened. "I believe your daughter has an extraordinary talent, Mrs. Montgomery, one worth compensating fairly. She's accomplished more with Midnight, our black stallion, in a few weeks than my most experienced hands managed in months." "This is highly irregular," Elizabeth protested, looking to her husband for support. "Robert, surely you can't approve of Abigail working as a common horsebreaker." "There's nothing common about your daughter's methods, madam," Dawson said, a hint of steel entering his voice. "In fact, I'd like to show you exactly what she's achieved if you're willing." Robert studied his daughter's face, then nodded slowly. "I think I'd like to see this for myself." Relief flooded through Abigail. At least her father was willing to observe before passing judgment. They moved from the dining room to the corrals, where Midnight had been prepared for a demonstration. Abigail excused herself to change into her riding clothes, ignoring her mother's disapproving frown. When she emerged in her practical trousers and boots, Elizabeth's expression darkened further, but she said nothing, mindful of their hosts. Midnight recognized Abigail immediately, trotting to the fence to greet her as she approached. "Hello, beautiful," she murmured, stroking his velvet nose. Then, Aware of her audience, she entered the corral and began demonstrating the training progression she had developed. The stallion responded to her every subtle cue, walking, trotting, changing direction, all without bridle or saddle, guided only by Abigail's voice and body language. Finally, she showed how he now accepted a saddle and rider, mounting him smoothly and guiding him through a series of controlled movements. When she dismounted and led Midnight back to where her parents stood watching, she saw conflicting emotions on their faces: astonishment, reluctant admiration, and, from her mother at least, lingering disapproval. "That was remarkable," Robert admitted. "I've never seen anything like it." "Your daughter has a rare gift," Dawson said quietly, "one that shouldn't be wasted." Elizabeth's lips were pressed into a thin line. "It's an unusual skill, certainly, but hardly an appropriate occupation for a young woman of Abigail's standing." "Why not?" The challenge came from Caroline. "Because society dictates that women should limit themselves to needlework and piano playing. Because a woman's primary duty is to her family," Elizabeth countered. "To marry well and establish a respectable household. How can Abigail hope to make a suitable match if she's known as a horse breaker who wears men's clothing?" The words stung, though Abigail had expected them. "Perhaps I don't want a suitable match as you define it, Mother. Perhaps I want a partner who values me for my abilities, not just my family name or my skills at embroidery." Dawson cleared his throat. "Mrs. Montgomery, if I may, Abigail's work here need not preclude a respectable future. In fact, I believe her unique abilities only enhance her character." Something in his tone made Abigail glance sharply at him. There was an intensity in his expression that hadn't been there before. Elizabeth seemed unmoved. "Mr. Valero, while I appreciate your defense of my daughter, I must speak plainly. This arrangement cannot continue. It's simply not appropriate." "Elizabeth," Robert began, but his wife continued. "Furthermore, I'm concerned about Abigail's reputation, spending so much time here unchaperoned." "I assure you I've been present at all times," Caroline interjected. "Abigail's reputation has been carefully protected." "Nevertheless," Elizabeth insisted, "a young woman in her position must be beyond reproach, especially with Dr. Henderson's son showing such marked interest." Abigail felt her cheeks flame. "Mother, please, Andrew Henderson is a fine young man from an excellent family," Elizabeth continued, addressing Dawson and Caroline now. "He's made his intentions toward Abigail quite clear. This diversion with horses must end before it jeopardizes her prospects." An uncomfortable silence fell. Abigail couldn't bring herself to look at Dawson, afraid of what she might see in his face at this revelation about Andrew. Finally, Robert spoke. "I think perhaps we've imposed on the Valeros' hospitality long enough. Caroline, Dawson, thank you for a lovely afternoon. Abigail, it's time we returned home." The finality in her father's tone left no room for argument. Abigail murmured her thanks to their hosts, still avoiding Dawson's gaze, and followed her parents to the waiting carriage. As they pulled away from the ranch, she glanced back just once. Dawson stood watching their departure, his expression unreadable in the fading afternoon light. Something tightened in her chest, a painful combination of regret, defiance, and an emotion she wasn't yet ready to name. The tense silence in the carriage lasted until they were halfway home. Then Elizabeth turned to her daughter with tightly controlled anger. "How could you embarrass us this way, Abigail? Working as a common laborer, dressing in men's clothing after all we've sacrificed to give you a proper upbringing." "I'm not embarrassed by honest work," Abigail replied, fighting to keep her voice level. "And I haven't been working as a common laborer. I've been using skills that no one else at the ranch possesses. "Your mother is concerned about your reputation," Robert said more gently, "and rightfully so. A young woman in your position must consider how her actions appear to others." "Why?" The question burst from her with unexpected force. "Why must I constantly worry about appearances when men are free to pursue their interests without such constraints?" "Because that's the way of the world," Elizabeth answered sharply. "Whether you like it or not, your future depends on making a respectable match. And no respectable man will marry a woman known for breaking horses and wearing trousers." The words echoed Dawson's earlier warning, but instead of accepting them as wisdom, Abigail felt a surge of rebellion. "Then perhaps I don't want a respectable man," she said quietly. "Perhaps I want someone who values me for who I truly am, not who society expects me to be." Her father studied her face with a combination of concern and something that might have been understanding. "Abigail, is there something specific between you and Dawson Valero that we should know about?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. "No," she said too quickly. "Mr. Valero is my employer, nothing more." Neither of her parents looked convinced, but they didn't press the issue. Instead, Elizabeth said firmly, "Regardless, this employment arrangement is at an end. You will not return to the Valero ranch except for appropriate social calls, properly chaperoned." "Mother, this is not negotiable, Abigail." Elizabeth's tone left no room for argument. "You are still our daughter living under our roof. While that remains the case, you will abide by our rules." Abigail fell silent, turning to look out the window at the passing landscape. She had known this confrontation was inevitable, had prepared herself for disapproval and restrictions. What she hadn't anticipated was the hollow feeling in her chest at the thought of not returning to the ranch, not working with Midnight and the other horses, not seeing Dawson each day. That evening, alone in her room, Abigail came to a decision. She would not abandon her work at the ranch, nor the horses that needed her, nor the man whose gray eyes had begun to haunt her dreams. But continuing would require a boldness beyond anything she had attempted before. It would require her to take complete control of her own destiny, whatever the consequences. Dawn found Abigail at the Valero ranch once more, but this time her arrival was no secret. She had left a letter for her parents explaining her decision and her whereabouts. It wasn't running away, she was 22, after all, but it was a clear declaration of independence. Caroline answered her knock, surprise giving way to understanding as Abigail briefly explained the situation. "You can stay here as long as you need," she assured her. "The guest room is yours." "Thank you. I don't want to impose nonsense. I've been hoping for female companionship since I arrived." Caroline ushered her inside. "Dawson's out checking the north pasture. He should return by noon." Relief and anxiety battled within Abigail. What would Dawson think of her decision? Would he see it as an undue complication, a reason to end their professional arrangement? She busied herself with the horses while waiting for his return, finding comfort in Midnight's welcoming nickering and the simple routines of the stable. By mid-morning, she had settled her few belongings in the guest room and helped Caroline with household tasks, grateful for the older woman's unquestioning acceptance. Shortly after noon, the sound of hoofbeats announced Dawson's return. Abigail was in the corral with Pearl, the nervous bay mare, when he rode in. He dismounted slowly, his expression unreadable as he took in her presence. "Caroline told me you'd arrived," he said, approaching the corral fence. "With luggage." Abigail nodded, suddenly uncertain under his steady gaze. "My parents insisted I end my work here. I disagreed." "So you've left home?" It wasn't a question. "Temporarily," she clarified, "until they understand that I'm old enough to make my own decisions." Dawson removed his hat, running a hand through hair tousled by the wind. Your mother mentioned Dr. Henderson's son yesterday, said his intentions toward you were clear. The statement hung in the air between them, laden with unasked questions. Andrew Henderson has made his interest known, she acknowledged, but I have never encouraged him. Haven't you? His voice was carefully neutral. No, she met his gaze directly. My parents favor the match, I do not. Something flickered in his eyes, relief perhaps, or something deeper. Abigail, are you certain about this decision? Your parents' disapproval, the potential damage to your reputation. These aren't small considerations. I'm certain about one thing, she replied steadily. I won't abandon what I've started here, not the horses, not the work. She hesitated, then added more softly, not the people. Understanding passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of the connection that had been growing steadily since that first dawn encounter. Dawson nodded once, decisively. Then the guest room is yours for as long as you need it, and your position here remains secure. Thank you. The simple words seemed inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. He replaced his hat, preparing to lead his horse to the stable. Your father will come looking for you, you know. I know. I left a letter explaining my whereabouts. I'm not hiding. Good. Because I won't lie to your father if he asks. Dawson paused, then added, but I won't send you back against your will either. The promise warmed her more than it should have. I appreciate that. As he turned to go, she called after him, Dawson. It was the first time she had used his given name. He looked back, one eyebrow raised in question. I'm sorry if my presence here complicates things for you. A smile, a real one, not the half-smiles she was accustomed to, transformed his features. Abigail Montgomery, you've been complicating my life since the moment I found you in my corral at dawn. I'm starting to think I don't mind complications. With that, he led his horse toward the stable, leaving Abigail with the distinct impression that something fundamental had shifted between them once more. That evening, the three of them sat around the dinner table in a surprisingly comfortable domestic scene. Caroline had prepared a simple but delicious meal, and conversation flowed easily among them. Abigail found herself laughing more than she had in years, caught up in the siblings' humorous stories and gentle teasing. I still can't believe you rode that half-broken bronco into the middle of the church picnic, Caroline was saying, recounting one of Dawson's youthful misadventures. Mother nearly fainted. It wasn't intentional, Dawson protested. He bolted when Mrs. Hargrove's umbrella spooked him. And yet somehow you managed to sweep directly past Millicent Potter's table, ruining her prize-winning berry pies, Caroline reminded him with a mischievous smile. Pure coincidence, Dawson insisted, but the twinkle in his eye suggested otherwise. Millicent Potter, Abigail asked. The minister's daughter, Caroline explained, who had rejected Dawson's invitation to the Founders' Day dance the previous week in favor of Theodore Whitcomb. Now that was poor judgment on her part, Dawson said with mock solemnity. Theodore couldn't dance to save his life. Neither could you, his sister pointed out. True, but at least I had other redeeming qualities. Such as modesty, Caroline added dryly, making Abigail laugh again. As the evening progressed, Abigail realized how much she was enjoying this glimpse of Dawson's personal life, the history and family connections that made him who he was. The stern rancher who had caught her breaking his horse seemed far removed from this relaxed, occasionally playful man sharing stories across the dinner table. After dinner, Caroline excused herself to write letters, leaving Dawson and Abigail alone in the parlor. A moment of awkward silence fell between them. Your sister is wonderful, Abigail said finally. Thank you both for welcoming me like this. Caroline's always had a soft spot for rebellious spirits. Dawson smiled slightly. And as for me, well, I understand what it means to choose your own path, even when others disapprove. Your father, she guessed. Remembering Caroline's comments about their family history, Dawson nodded, his expression growing more serious. He had our lives planned out from birth. The proper schools, the right connections, suitable marriages to advance the family standing. I was meant to be a lawyer in Boston, married to a banker's daughter. But you wanted something different. I wanted this. He gestured broadly, indicating not just the room but everything beyond it, the ranch, the open land, the life he had built. Freedom to make my own choices, succeed or fail on my own terms. Did he ever understand? Abigail asked quietly. No. A shadow crossed Dawson's face. He died believing I'd wasted my potential. We never reconciled. The admission seemed to cost him something. Abigail sensed he rarely spoke of this painful history. I'm sorry, she said simply. Dawson shrugged, an attempt at casualness that didn't quite succeed. It was a long time ago. And I've made peace with my choices, even if he never did. Is that why you're supporting my decision now? Because you understand what it means to defy expectations? He considered this. Partly, but also because I believe you have a genuine gift. It would be a shame to see it stifled by convention. Their gazes met across the room, and in that moment, Abigail felt a connection deeper than shared interests or mutual respect. They were kindred spirits in some fundamental way, both unwilling to be confined by others' expectations, both determined to chart their own course. The next morning, Abigail woke to the sound of voices downstairs, one of them unmistakably her father's. Heart racing, she dressed quickly and made her way to the parlor, where she found Robert Montgomery seated across from Dawson, both men with grave expressions. Father, she acknowledged, lifting her chin slightly. Robert stood. Abigail, I've come to bring you home. I'm not ready to return, she said quietly but firmly. Your mother is beside herself with worry. His tone was reproachful but not angry, and there are serious concerns about the propriety of this arrangement. Caroline is here as chaperone, Abigail pointed out. My reputation is protected. Is it? Her father glanced at Dawson, who had remained silent. The entire town is talking about Dr. Montgomery's daughter who's moved into the Valero ranch to train horses. The implication was clear, and Abigail felt her cheeks flush with indignation. Then the town has a dirty mind. Nothing improper has occurred here. Dawson finally spoke. Dr. Montgomery, I understand your concerns, but I give you my word as a gentleman that your daughter has been treated with nothing but respect in my home. I believe you, Mr. Valero. Robert's expression softened slightly. I know you to be an honorable man, but intentions and appearances are different matters. Then let appearances be damned, Abigail said with unexpected heat. I'm 22 years old. I've found work I love and excel at. Why should I abandon that because of gossip and outdated conventions? Her father studied her face for a long moment. You've always been headstrong, Abigail, like your grandmother, he sighed deeply. I didn't come to force you home. I came to understand. The admission surprised her. Understand what? Why this matters so much to you. Why you'd risk your standing in society, your relationship with your mother, all for horses. It's not just about the horses, she said slowly. It's about being valued for my abilities rather than just my family name or my suitability as a wife. It's about having the freedom to discover who I truly am. Robert nodded, as though her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. Your mother believes this is a passing phase rebellion before you settle into the life expected of you. And what do you believe, Father? He glanced at Dawson, then back to his daughter. I believe you're more like me than either of us realized. I defied my father too, you know. He wanted me to take over the family shipping business in Boston. I wanted to study medicine and help people." This was a story Abigail had heard before, but never fully appreciated until now. "You followed your calling despite opposition." "Yes, and I've never regretted it." Robert straightened his shoulders. "I won't force you to return home, Abigail. But I ask that you consider the consequences of your choices carefully." "I have considered them," she assured him. "Have you?" He looked pointedly at Dawson again. "All of them." The implication was clear. Her father suspected there was more between her and Dawson than a professional relationship, and he wasn't entirely wrong. "I know what I'm doing, Father," she said quietly. Robert nodded once, accepting her decision if not entirely approving of it. "Very well. I'll tell your mother you're safe and well cared for. The rest we'll address in time." The conversation ended with an uneasy truce. Robert would respect Abigail's decision to remain at the ranch, and in return, she promised to visit home regularly and consider her mother's feelings. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a beginning. As her father prepared to leave, he took Dawson aside for a private word. Abigail couldn't hear what was said, but the serious expressions on both men's faces suggested it was significant. When they rejoined her, Dawson's expression was unreadable once more. "Take care of yourself, Abigail," Robert said, embracing her briefly. "And remember that your home is always open to you, whatever your mother might say in the heat of emotion." "Thank you, Father." The words felt inadequate for the understanding he had shown. After he had gone, Abigail turned to Dawson. "What did he say to you?" Dawson hesitated, then replied simply, "He asked me to protect your reputation as carefully as I would protect my sister's." "And what did you tell him?" "That I would guard it more carefully than my own." The quiet intensity of his words stirred something deep within her, a recognition of what remained unspoken between them, growing stronger with each passing day. In the weeks that followed, Abigail settled into life at the Valero ranch with surprising ease. Her days fell into a comfortable rhythm, working with the horses in the morning, helping Caroline with household tasks in the afternoon, and evenings spent in the companionable warmth of the parlor. She visited her parents' home once a week, enduring her mother's coolness while appreciating her father's growing acceptance of her choices. Midnight's training progressed rapidly. By early December, he was fully saddle-broken, responding to Abigail's commands with an eagerness that delighted both her and Dawson. The other difficult horses on the ranch similarly responded to her gentle methods, earning her the grudging respect of even the most skeptical ranch hands. "Jenkins actually tipped his hat to you yesterday," Dawson remarked one evening as they sat by the fire, Caroline having retired early with a headache. "I thought the man would sooner cut off his hand than show deference to a woman." Abigail smiled, warmed by the recognition. "He saw what Pearl could do with the new commands. That convinced him more than anything I could have said." "Results speak louder than words," Dawson agreed. "Something my father never understood. He valued appearance over substance. Unlike you." The observation slipped out before she could consider its implications. Dawson's gaze met hers across the space between their chairs. "What do you mean? You judge people by their actions, not their background or their social standing." She hesitated, then added quietly, "You gave me a chance when others wouldn't have." "I recognized something in you," he admitted, his voice dropping to match hers. "The same fire I've always felt the need to prove yourself on your own terms." The crackling fire and the howling wind outside created a cocoon of intimacy around them. Abigail became acutely aware of how alone they were, how the lamplight softened Dawson's features and caught the silver threads in his otherwise dark hair. "Dawson," she began, uncertain what she meant to say but feeling the need to acknowledge the growing tension between them. He leaned forward slightly. Yes. Before she could continue, the front door burst open, bringing a swirl of snow and a blast of cold air. One of the ranch hands, Ellis, stood in the doorway, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. "Boss," he gasped. "Storm's worse than we thought. Johnson and Peters ain't back from checking the north herd." Dawson was on his feet instantly. "How long have they been out?" "Since noon. Should have been back by sunset." Ellis stamped his feet, shaking snow from his boots. "Temperature's dropping fast. If they're caught out there, get Stewart and Miller," Dawson ordered, already moving toward the coat rack. "Lanterns, ropes, blankets. 5 minutes." Ellis nodded and disappeared back into the swirling snow. Dawson began pulling on his heavy coat and gloves, his movements swift and decisive. "You can't go out in this," Abigail protested, following him to the door. "The visibility must be near zero." "2 of my men are out there," he replied simply, wrapping a scarf around his neck. "We stick together on this ranch. No one gets left behind." The nobility of the sentiment struck her deeply. Of course he would go, it was who he was, a man who valued loyalty above personal safety. "Then I'm coming with you," she decided, reaching for her own coat. Dawson placed a hand on her arm, stopping her. "No, it's too dangerous." "I'm an excellent rider," she reminded him, "and you might need an extra pair of eyes." "Abigail." The gentleness in his voice contrasted with the urgency of the moment. "I need to know you're safe here, please." Something in his expression, a vulnerability she rarely glimpsed, made her relent. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said softly. Instead of answering, Dawson did something entirely unexpected. He cupped her face in his gloved hands and pressed his lips to hers in a brief but fervent kiss. "I'll come back," he promised against her lips. Then he was gone, swallowed by the howling storm before she could process what had just happened. Abigail stood frozen in the doorway, her fingers touching her lips where the warmth of his kiss lingered. Only the increasing cold finally drove her to close the door, her mind whirling with the implications of what had just occurred. Dawson had kissed her. In the midst of crisis, with no time for careful consideration or propriety, he had revealed feelings she had only dared to hope might exist. And now he was riding into a blizzard, perhaps the worst of the season, with no certainty of return. The hours that followed were among the longest of Abigail's life. She paced the parlor floor, started at every sound, and kept the fire blazing against the bitter cold that seeped through the walls despite the sturdy construction. Caroline joined her eventually, roused by the commotion, and together they maintained their vigil as midnight came and went with no sign of the search party. "He knows these lands better than anyone," Caroline assured her, though her own worry was evident. "Even in a blizzard, Dawson won't lose his way. But what if Johnson and Peters are injured, or their horses have gone lame?" Abigail couldn't stop the cascade of worst possibilities. "Then my stubborn brother will find a way to bring them home regardless." Caroline squeezed her hand. "He survived worse than this, Abigail." The confident words brought little comfort as the night stretched on, the storm howling around the house like a living thing. By 3 in the morning, Abigail had moved beyond fear to a numb state of dread. Caroline had dozed off in her chair, but Abigail remained alert, listening for any sound that might indicate their return. Finally, near dawn, she heard it, the distant sound of voices carried on the wind, growing stronger as they approached the house. She flung open the door to see a procession of exhausted men and horses emerging from the diminishing snowfall. Dawson rode at the front, another man slumped against him in the saddle. Behind them, Stewart led a horse with Peters tied securely to the saddle, apparently unconscious. All were covered in snow, their faces raw from the biting wind. "Get Doc Montgomery," Dawson called as they reached the yard. Johnson's got a broken leg and Peters is half frozen. Abigail was already moving, calling instructions to the ranch hands who had appeared to help. Bring them inside. Caroline, we need hot water and bandages. Someone ride for my father. No, wait, I can splint a broken leg until he arrives. The next hour passed in a flurry of activity. Johnson and Peters were brought into the warm house, their wet clothes replaced with dry blankets. Abigail worked alongside Caroline to warm Peters' dangerously cold extremities, while Dawson and Stewart carefully splinted Johnson's leg, using techniques Abigail directed. By the time Robert Montgomery arrived, responding to the urgent summons, both injured men were stabilized. Peters had regained consciousness, though he remained weak and confused, while Johnson bore his pain with stoic endurance. "You've done well," Robert told Abigail after examining both patients. "The splint is nearly as good as I could have managed myself." The praise warmed her, especially coming from her father in his professional capacity. "I've assisted you enough times to learn the basics," she reminded him. "More than the basics, it seems." He turned to Dawson, who stood nearby, his face gray with exhaustion. "And you, Mr. Valero, riding out in that storm was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish." "Probably both," Dawson admitted with a tired smile. "But we found them just in time. Another hour and—" He didn't need to complete the thought. Robert nodded gravely. "Johnson will need proper setting once the swelling reduces, but he should recover fully. Peters is suffering from mild exposure, but his youth is in his favor. Both owe you their lives. They'd have done the same for me." Dawson's simple statement reflected the code he lived by. As Robert prepared to transport the injured men to town for further care, he pulled Abigail aside. "Your mother would want me to use this as an opportunity to insist you return home," he said quietly, "to point out the dangers of ranch life. And will you?" she asked, bracing herself for the argument. To her surprise, Robert shook his head. "No. I saw how you handled this crisis, Abigail. Your calm competence, your quick thinking. You've found your place here, haven't you?" The understanding in his eyes brought tears to hers. "I think I have," she whispered. Robert glanced toward Dawson, who was helping load Johnson into the wagon. "And perhaps more than just a place of employment," heat rushed to her cheeks. "Father, I'm a doctor, Abigail. I observe people." He smiled slightly. "The way he looks at you. And you at him. It reminds me of how your mother and I were once upon a time." Before she could formulate a response, he kissed her forehead. "Be happy, daughter, but be careful with your heart, and his." With that cryptic advice, he departed with his patients, leaving Abigail to ponder his words and the events of the night. Dawson found her later in the stable, checking on Midnight and the other horses who had been unsettled by the storm. He looked utterly exhausted, dark circles under his eyes and his movements slowed by fatigue. "You should be resting," she admonished gently. "Probably." He leaned against a stall door watching her work. "But I wanted to check on you first. Me, I'm not the one who spent the night in a blizzard." "No, but—" He hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "About what happened before I left, you kissed me," she said simply, turning to face him fully. "I did." He didn't apologize or attempt to explain it away. "I've wanted to for weeks. Maybe since that first morning when I found you in my corral." The admission sent warmth spreading through her despite the lingering chill in the air. "Why didn't you?" "A dozen reasons. You were my employee. Your parents would disapprove. The difference in our backgrounds." He straightened, moving closer. "But mainly because I was afraid." "Afraid? You?" The notion seemed absurd. Dawson Valero, who had faced blizzards and wild stallions without flinching, afraid of a kiss, afraid that once I started I wouldn't want to stop. His voice dropped lower. afraid that what I feel for you goes far beyond admiration or attraction." Abigail's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "And what do you feel?" He took another step closer, close enough now that she could see the tiny flecks of blue in his gray eyes, the slight scar at his temple half hidden by his hair. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Abigail Montgomery. Maybe I already have." The words hung in the air between them, momentous and fragile. Abigail felt as though she stood on the edge of a precipice, the next words determining whether she would fall or fly. "Dawson," she whispered, reaching out to touch his face. "I think I've loved you since you said I'd broken something wilder than your horse." A smile, the full, unreserved smile that transformed his entire face, broke across his features. "Did I say that? I was trying to sound poetic. It worked." She laughed softly. "Though I didn't fully understand what you meant until later. And now," he covered her hand with his own where it rested against his cheek, "now I think you were right. Something wild and precious happened that morning." Her voice grew serious. "Something I don't want to lose. You won't." The promise was fervent. "Whatever comes, whatever obstacles we face, I won't let you go." This time when he kissed her, there was no urgency, no impending crisis. Just the slow, tender exploration of feelings too long denied expression. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, while her hands slid into his hair, anchoring them both in the moment. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, Abigail felt as though something fundamental had shifted within her, a certainty about her path forward that had been missing before. "My father knows," she said softly, "about us, or at least he suspects. And I think he understands, more than I expected." She leaned her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "But my mother will be harder to convince." Dawson's chuckle rumbled beneath her ear. "I've faced wild stallions, blizzards, and cattle rustlers, Abigail. I think I can handle one disapproving mother." "Don't underestimate Elizabeth Montgomery," she warned, though she couldn't help smiling. "She's formidable when it comes to protecting her idea of my future. Then we'll just have to show her that your future could be brighter than she imagined." He kissed the top of her head. "Together." The simple word contained worlds of meaning: shared dreams, shared challenges, shared joys. Together they could face whatever came their way, just as they had faced the crisis of the night. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving a world transformed by glistening snow under a clearing sky. Inside the stable, warmed by each other's presence and the promise of what lay ahead, Dawson and Abigail began to plan a future neither had anticipated when she first snuck onto his ranch at dawn to break his wild horse. Spring arrived in Montana with a sudden burst of green across the plains and a riot of wildflowers on the hillsides. The harsh winter had finally released its grip, allowing life to reassert itself with vibrant enthusiasm. At the Valero Ranch, the changing season brought new foals, longer days, and increased activity as the business of running a successful operation resumed its normal pace. For Abigail, it also brought a sense of settled purpose she had never experienced before. In the months since the blizzard, her relationship with Dawson had deepened into something neither could imagine living without. They worked side by side during the days, her gentle methods with the horses complementing his practical knowledge of ranch operations. In the evenings, they shared quiet conversations by the fire, dreams of the future, and increasingly passionate kisses when they could steal moments alone. Caroline observed their growing attachment with obvious approval, often finding excuses to leave them unattended despite her nominal role as chaperone. "You two aren't fooling anyone," she told them one evening after dinner. "The way you look at each other could heat this entire house without a fire." Abigail had blushed while Dawson merely grinned unrepentantly. "Is it that obvious?" she asked. "To anyone with eyes," Caroline confirmed. "Including half of Bozeman, I'd imagine." This reminder of public scrutiny sobered Abigail. While her father had come to accept her choices, both her work with horses and her attachment to Dawson, her mother, remained steadfastly opposed. Elizabeth had even stopped joining Robert on his weekly visits to the ranch, unable to reconcile herself to what she viewed as her daughter's social regression. "She'll come around," Caroline assured her, noticing her changed expression. "Mothers always do when they see their children truly happy." Abigail wasn't so certain, but she tried to focus on the positive developments in her life. Her reputation as a horse trainer had spread beyond the Valero ranch, bringing requests from other ranchers in the territory for her expertise with particularly difficult animals. Dawson had encouraged her to accept these opportunities, proud of her growing professional recognition. Midnight, her first success, had become her personal mount, a gift from Dawson that had moved her to tears when he presented the stallion to her on her 23rd birthday in February. "He was always meant to be yours," he had said simply, "from the moment you two chose each other." Now, on a brilliant April morning, Abigail rode Midnight across the eastern pasture, reveling in the perfect communion between horse and rider that made it seem as though they moved as one being. Dawson had asked her to check the new foals born to the mares in that section, a task she gladly accepted. She dismounted near a small group of mares with their gangly offspring, taking time to examine each one for signs of health or potential problems. As she worked, her mind wandered to thoughts of her future with Dawson. They hadn't explicitly discussed marriage, though the assumption seemed to underlie their relationship. Sometimes, she caught him watching her with an expression that suggested he was considering something important. But whatever it was, he had yet to share it with her. So absorbed was she in these thoughts that she didn't hear the approaching rider until he was nearly upon her. Looking up, she was startled to see Andrew Henderson dismounting from his horse a few yards away. "Andrew," she acknowledged, rising to her feet. "This is unexpected." He looked much as she remembered, neatly dressed even for riding, his blonde hair carefully combed, his expression a mixture of disapproval and determination. "Abigail, I've been hoping to speak with you privately." "Has someone fallen ill?" she asked, assuming his presence must be professional. Your father is fine," he interrupted. "I'm here on a personal matter." Something in his tone put her immediately on guard. "I see. Well, as you can observe, I'm rather occupied at the moment." "Yes, examining horses." He couldn't quite keep the disdain from his voice. "I understand you've made quite a name for yourself as a horse trainer." The deliberate pause before the title made it clear what he thought of her chosen profession. Abigail straightened, lifting her chin slightly. "I have, yes. Is that what you wish to discuss?" Andrew took a step closer. "Abigail, I've respected your need for independence these past months, your desire to, shall we say, sow some wild oats before settling into a proper life." The condescension in his tone raised her hackles. "I beg your pardon." "But surely this experiment has run its course," he continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Your mother is beside herself with worry about your reputation. Your father misses your assistance in his practice, and I—" He hesitated, then forged ahead. "I am still prepared to offer you the security of marriage, despite the unorthodox choices you've made recently." Abigail stared at him, momentarily speechless. Was he actually suggesting that his marriage proposal was still available to her, as though he were doing her a favor by overlooking her unorthodox choices? "Andrew," she said finally, keeping her voice level with effort, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm quite content with my life as it is." Are you? He glanced around the pasture, at the mares and foals, at her practical riding attire. Living in another man's house, working as a common laborer, risking your reputation daily. This is the life you prefer to being Mrs. Dr. Henderson. The question was so laden with assumptions that Abigail hardly knew where to begin addressing them. First, I am not a common laborer. I am a skilled horse trainer who is paid fairly for expertise that few possess. Second, my living arrangement includes Caroline Valero as chaperone, which is entirely proper. And third, she paused, meeting his gaze directly. Yes, this is precisely the life I prefer to being Mrs. Dr. Henderson. Andrew's face flushed with anger or embarrassment, perhaps both. It's Valero, isn't it? He's turned your head with flattery and false promises. Dawson has never made me any promises he didn't intend to keep, she replied evenly. And he respects me for who I am, not who he wishes me to be. Respects you, Andrew scoffed. The man has a reputation, Abigail. Ask anyone in town about the women he's. That's enough. The cold interruption came from behind them. Dawson sat astride Calliope a few yards away, his expression dangerous in its calmness. Dr. Henderson, I believe you're trespassing on my property. Andrew turned to face him, visibly gathering his dignity. Mr. Valero, I was just explaining to Abigail that her place is in town, among respectable society, not here. Is that so? Dawson dismounted, his movements deliberate. And did she seem persuaded by your argument? She's confused, Andrew insisted, glancing back at Abigail. Led astray by romantic notions of independence that aren't practical for a woman of her standing. Dawson's jaw tightened, but his voice remained controlled. Abigail Montgomery has more practical sense in her little finger than most men have in their entire bodies, and she's perfectly capable of deciding where she belongs without your guidance. He moved to stand beside Abigail, not touching her but close enough to make his position clear. She felt a surge of gratitude for his presence, for the quiet strength he offered without attempting to speak for her or make her decisions. Andrew looked between them, understanding dawning in his eyes. So it is like that, he said quietly. I wondered but hoped the rumors were exaggerated. Andrew, Abigail began, softening her tone slightly. I never encouraged your interest. I'm sorry if I've caused you pain, but pain. He gave a short, humorless laugh. My dear, you've simply confirmed what I already suspected, that you lack the judgment necessary for a suitable match. When you tire of playing cowgirl and breaking horses, don't expect my offer to still stand. With that, he mounted his horse and rode away without looking back, his rigid posture betraying his wounded pride more than his words had done. Dawson watched him go, then turned to Abigail. Are you all right? She nodded, though her hands trembled slightly with the aftermath of the confrontation. Yes, just surprised by his appearance and his assumptions. That you'd eventually come to your senses and accept his generous proposal. Dawson's voice held a hint of wry humor now. He doesn't know you very well, does he? No, she agreed softly. He never did. Not really. Dawson reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face with gentle fingers. And do you regret your choices, I mean? The question was asked lightly, but Abigail caught the underlying uncertainty. Despite all they had shared, Dawson still harbored moments of doubt, wondering if she might someday long for the respectability and security of town life over the unpredictability of the ranch. Not for a moment, she assured him, leaning into his touch. This is where I belong, Dawson. With the horses, with the land. She met his gaze steadily. With you. Relief washed over his features, followed by a determination that made her heart quicken. I'm glad to hear that, he said, taking both her hands in his, because there's something I've been wanting to ask you for weeks now. Yes, she prompted when he paused. I had planned something more romantic, he admitted with a rueful smile. Dinner by candlelight, flowers, all those things women are supposed to appreciate. But seeing Henderson here, hearing him offer you the life I can't, the life I don't want, she corrected gently. Even so. He squeezed her hands. It made me realize I can't wait for the perfect moment, because every moment with you is already perfect, Abigail. Even when we're arguing about horse training methods, or you're beating me at chess, or we're riding out in the rain to check on a sick calf. Emotion welled in her chest, making it difficult to speak. Dawson, marry me, he said simply. Be my partner in everything, the ranch, the horses, life itself. I love you, Abigail Montgomery, more than I thought it was possible to love another person. The words she had been waiting to hear, spoken with such straightforward honesty that tears sprang to her eyes. Yes, she whispered, and then more strongly. Yes, Dawson Valero, I will marry you. He pulled her into his arms then, kissing her with a passion that left no doubt of his feelings. Abigail responded in kind, pouring all her love and certainty into the embrace. When they finally parted, both breathless, Dawson pressed his forehead against hers. I don't have a ring yet, he confessed. I wanted to find something as unique as you are. I don't need a ring, she assured him. Just you. He smiled, that full, unreserved smile that still made her heart skip. You have me, always. They rode back to the ranch together, the news of their engagement lighting them from within. Caroline's delight was effusive and immediate. Finally, she exclaimed, embracing them both. I was beginning to think I'd need to lock you two in the stable to get you to declare yourselves. Your brother is more traditional than you might think, Abigail told her, laughing. He wanted everything to be perfect. And instead he proposed in a pasture surrounded by horse manure, Caroline observed dryly. How romantic. It was perfect, Abigail insisted, exchanging a warm glance with Dawson, because it was honest, like him. The question of telling her parents loomed larger as the day progressed. Abigail knew her father would likely approve. He had grown to respect Dawson over the months of her residence at the ranch, but her mother was another matter entirely. We should tell them together, she decided that evening. Properly, at their home. Dawson nodded, though apprehension flickered in his eyes. Will your mother even receive me? She'll have to, Abigail said with more confidence than she felt. You're going to be her son-in-law whether she approves or not. The following afternoon found them at the Montgomery home in Bozeman, seated in the formal parlor where Abigail had spent countless hours entertaining suitable young men under her mother's watchful eye. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her, as she observed Elizabeth's barely concealed disapproval of Dawson's presence. To what do we owe this visit? Robert asked, though his knowing gaze suggested he had already guessed their purpose. Dawson cleared his throat, meeting the older man's eyes directly. Dr. Montgomery, Mrs. Montgomery, I've asked your daughter to marry me, and she has accepted. I'm here to formally request your blessing. Elizabeth gasped softly, her hand flying to her throat in a gesture of distress. Mary. But I love your daughter, Dawson continued steadily. I admire her intelligence, her determination, her gentle strength, and I promise to spend my life making her happiness my highest priority. Robert studied the younger man's face for a long moment, then turned to his daughter. And you, Abigail, are you certain this is what you want? More certain than I've ever been about anything, she replied without hesitation. I love him, Father, and with him I can be fully myself. Robert, you cannot possibly consider approving this match, Elizabeth protested, finding her voice at last. Mr. Valero is a rancher. Abigail was raised for better prospects. Better, Dawson repeated quietly. In what way, madam? I own a successful ranch, free and clear. I can provide Abigail with comfort and security. My family connections in the East would ensure her acceptance in any society she wished to enter. This last revelation clearly surprised Elizabeth. Your family? My father was Nathaniel Valero of Boston, Dawson explained. The shipping magnate. I chose a different path, but I wasn't born to it. Elizabeth blinked rapidly, absorbing this new information. I had no idea. Because it doesn't matter to me, Dawson said simply. What matters is building something of value with my own hands. Creating a life worth living, not just inheriting one. Robert nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. And this is the life you want for my daughter, working alongside you on the ranch, continuing her work with horses. It's the life we want to build together, Dawson corrected gently. I would never presume to determine Abigail's path for her. That's precisely why we suit each other so well. Something in these words seemed to reach Elizabeth. She looked at her daughter with new eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time the woman Abigail had become rather than the daughter she had tried to mold. You truly love him? She asked softly. With all my heart, Abigail confirmed. Elizabeth sighed deeply, an admission of defeat that contained a hint of grudging acceptance. Then I suppose we must adjust our expectations. It wasn't wholehearted approval, but it was a beginning. Robert, more decisive, rose to shake Dawson's hand. You have my blessing, he said firmly. Though I suspect you would have proceeded without it if necessary. We would have preferred to have it, Dawson acknowledged. Family matters to both of us. When do you plan to marry? Elizabeth asked, her practical nature asserting itself now that the initial shock had passed. June, Abigail replied. When the wildflowers cover the hills near the ranch, we thought a small ceremony there with family and close friends. Elizabeth looked momentarily aghast at the idea of a wedding outside the church, but visibly restrained herself from commenting. Well, there's much to plan. Invitations, your dress, the reception. As her mother launched into wedding preparations, transforming disapproval into organizational energy, Abigail caught Dawson's eye across the room. His expression of bemused relief made her smile, a private communication in the midst of Elizabeth's planning flurry. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, just as they had faced every obstacle since that fateful dawn when he caught her breaking his wild horse. June arrived with perfect weather for a wedding: clear blue skies, gentle breezes, and hillsides blanketed with wildflowers in every hue imaginable. Abigail stood at the window of her childhood bedroom, gazing out at the town of Bozeman for the last time as an unmarried woman. Tonight she would return to the Valero ranch, her home now in every sense of the word. You look beautiful, her father said from the doorway. Abigail turned, smoothing the skirt of her wedding dress, a creation of ivory silk with delicate lace trim, elegant but practical enough for an outdoor ceremony. Thank you, Father. Robert entered the room, his eyes suspiciously bright. Your mother has outdone herself with the preparations. I believe half of Montana Territory will be at the ranch this afternoon. Abigail laughed. I hope not. We wanted something small, remember. Small by Elizabeth Montgomery's standards is still quite substantial. He smiled fondly. She's trying, Abigail, in her own way, I know. And she did. Over the past weeks, her mother had gradually come to terms with her daughter's choice, even developing a cautious respect for Dawson as she learned more about his background and his current success. Are you ready? Robert offered his arm. The carriage is waiting. Abigail took a deep breath, steadying herself. I've been ready since the moment I met him, she said softly. I just didn't know it then. The ride to the Valero ranch was filled with quiet anticipation. Abigail watched the familiar landscape pass by, thinking of how much had changed in the year since she first approached the ranch at dawn, determined to prove herself with a wild stallion no one could tame. When they arrived, she was touched to see how the ranch had been transformed for the occasion. White ribbons and wildflowers adorned the fences and buildings. Chairs had been arranged in neat rows before an arch of greenery and blooms situated on a gentle rise overlooking the valley. Guests mingled in small groups, townsfolk from Bozeman, neighboring ranchers, and a few relatives who had traveled from the east. Caroline met their carriage, resplendent in a gown of cornflower blue. "He's nervous," she whispered to Abigail with a conspiratorial smile. "Pacing like one of his colts before a thunderstorm." The image made Abigail smile. Dawson, who faced cattle rustlers and blizzards without flinching, nervous about their wedding. Everything passed in a blur after that, being escorted to a small tent where final adjustments were made to her appearance. Hearing the music begin, taking her father's arm for the walk down the makeshift aisle. But one moment crystallized in perfect clarity. The first glimpse of Dawson waiting for her beneath the flower-covered arch. He wore a new suit, his dark hair tamed for the occasion, but it was his expression that caught her heart, a mixture of awe, joy, and love so powerful it nearly took her breath away. When her father placed her hand in Dawson's, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them despite the gathered witnesses. The minister's words washed over her, meaningful but secondary to the connection flowing between them as they spoke their vows. "I, Dawson James Valero, take you, Abigail Grace Montgomery, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he began, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." When it was her turn, Abigail's voice rang clear across the assembled gathering. "I, Abigail Grace Montgomery, take you, Dawson James Valero, to be my lawfully wedded husband. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." The exchange of rings, a simple gold band for Dawson, and for Abigail a more elaborate design featuring a diamond surrounded by smaller sapphires that matched her eyes, sealed their promises to each other. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "Mr. Valero, you may kiss your bride." Dawson didn't hesitate. His kiss was tender but fervent, a promise of the life they would build together. When they turned to face their guests, hands clasped tightly, the applause that greeted them felt like a blessing from the community that had witnessed their unlikely journey. The celebration that followed was everything Abigail could have hoped for: joyful, relaxed, a perfect blend of refinement and rustic charm. Even Elizabeth seemed to enjoy herself, particularly when several of Dawson's Eastern relatives engaged her in conversation about Boston society. As evening approached, guests began to depart, offering final congratulations and well wishes. Abigail found herself standing with Dawson near the corral where Midnight watched the proceedings with intelligent interest. "Happy?" Dawson asked, his arm around her waist. "Completely." She leaned against him, savoring the solid strength of his presence. "Though I'm ready for all our guests to leave so I can have my husband to myself," he chuckled, the sound reverberating through her. "Patience, Mrs. Valero, just a little longer." The new name sent a thrill through her. "Mrs. Valero, Abigail Valero." It felt right, a perfect fit. "I have something for you," Dawson said suddenly. "A wedding gift, though it's not exactly traditional." "Oh." She looked up at him curiously. He gestured toward the largest pasture where several mares grazed with their foals. "The 10 acres on the east side. I've had the papers drawn up. It's yours, legally separate from the ranch. to establish your own breeding program, focusing on horses with the temperament and intelligence for your gentle training methods. Abigail stared at him, momentarily speechless. It was the most perfect gift he could have given her, not jewelry or typical household items, but the means to develop her own professional legacy alongside their shared life. "Dawson," she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll build something remarkable," he replied simply. "Something uniquely yours that bears your name and your vision." "Our vision," she corrected, tears of joy threatening. "Everything I am, everything I hope to become is intertwined with you now." He kissed her again, oblivious to the few remaining guests who might be watching. "Mrs. Valero," he murmured against her lips, "I believe I've only begun to discover all the ways you'll surprise me." Later that night, after the last guests had departed and they were finally alone as husband and wife, Abigail stood on the porch of their home, gazing at the star-filled Montana sky. Dawson joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. She turned in his embrace, reaching up to trace the beloved contours of his face. "Only that it took me so long to find you." "You found me at exactly the right moment," he countered. "Breaking my wild horse at dawn, challenging everything I thought I knew about training animals, about women, about life." "You said I'd broken something wilder," she reminded him, smiling at the memory. "My heart," he confirmed, "though I think captured might be more accurate than broken." Abigail rose on tiptoe to kiss him, pouring all her love and promise into the embrace. "Take me to bed, husband," she whispered. "We have a lifetime to begin." As Dawson swept her into his arms to carry her over the threshold, Abigail knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the arms of the man who had seen her wildness as strength and her determination as grace. Together, they would build a life as vast and beautiful as the Montana skies, as strong and enduring as the mountains that watched over their ranch, as wild and free as the horses they both loved. And it had all begun with a dawn encounter, a wild stallion and a cowboy who recognized that some spirits are meant to run free, side by side, across the endless horizon of possibility. 5 years later, Abigail stood at the fence of her breeding paddock, watching with pride as a group of 2-year-olds demonstrated the intelligence and gentle temperament she had carefully cultivated. The Montgomery method, as it had come to be known throughout the territory, had revolutionized horse training in ways she could hardly have imagined when she first approached midnight in Dawson's corral. "Mama, look." 4-year-old Thomas James Valero bounced excitedly beside her, pointing to a chestnut filly who had approached the fence to investigate them. "She likes me." "Of course she does, sweetheart." Abigail smiled down at her son, so like his father with those storm-gray eyes and determined chin, though he had inherited her auburn hair. "You have the touch, just like your grandmother taught me." Thomas reached out carefully to stroke the filly's velvet nose, his small face serious with concentration. "Gentle hands, quiet voice," he recited, the mantra Abigail had taught him from his earliest interactions with the horses. "Perfect," she praised him. "Someday you'll be breaking horses just like your father and me." A slight movement at her skirts reminded Abigail of her other child. 2-year-old Emma Caroline clung to her mother's dress with one hand while sucking her thumb thoughtfully, observing her brother's interaction with the horse. Unlike Thomas's immediate affinity for the animals, Emma approached them with cautious curiosity, a temperament more like Dawson's measured approach than Abigail's impulsive nature. "Would you like to pet her too, Emma?" Abigail asked, crouching down to her daughter's level. The little girl shook her head, auburn curls bouncing, but she watched with fascination as Thomas continued his one-sided conversation with the filly. "Another time," Abigail assured her. "There's no hurry." The sound of approaching hoofbeats made all three of them turn. Dawson rode toward them on Midnight, who had aged gracefully into his prime, still magnificent at 9 years old. Thomas immediately began waving wildly. "Papa, Papa, come see the new filly." Dawson dismounted with the easy grace that still made Abigail's heart skip, even after 5 years of marriage. He swept Thomas up into his arms for a hug, then bent to kiss Emma's cheek before turning to Abigail. "Mrs. Valero," he greeted her formally, though his eyes danced with the private humor they had always shared. "Mr. Valero," she responded in kind, accepting his kiss with a smile. "You're back earlier than expected. The cattle drive went smoothly, got a good price in Helena." He set Thomas down, ruffling his son's hair affectionately. "And I missed my family. We missed you too." She leaned against him, savoring his solid presence after the 2 weeks he'd been away. Especially at night. He raised an eyebrow, the hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "Is that so?" "MMM," she nodded seriously. "Emma had a nightmare almost every night, ended up in our bed kicking me until dawn." Dawson laughed, pulling her closer for another kiss. "Not exactly what I was hoping to hear, but I'll take it." "Papa, come see," Thomas insisted, tugging at his father's hand. "The filly can count. Mama taught her, did she now?" Dawson allowed himself to be led toward the fence, Emma trailing behind, suddenly brave enough to approach now that her father was present. Abigail watched them with a heart so full it threatened to overflow. The past 5 years had brought challenges, of course harsh winters, difficult foalings, the usual trials of building a life together. But they had also brought a deepening of the connection that had begun that fateful dawn when she'd been caught breaking his wild horse. The Montgomery Valero Ranch had prospered beyond their expectations. Dawson's traditional breeding program continued to produce excellent working horses for the territory's ranches and farms, while Abigail's specialized training methods had attracted attention from as far away as San Francisco and even Europe. Even Elizabeth Montgomery had eventually come to appreciate her daughter's unconventional path. The turning point had been Thomas's birth, which had transformed Elizabeth from disapproving mother to doting grandmother almost overnight. Now she visited regularly, bringing gifts for the children, and occasionally even asking Abigail's advice on a nervous mare her father had purchased. "Look, Papa." Thomas was demonstrating how the filly would paw the ground the exact number of times he tapped the fence. "She's counting." "That's remarkable, son," Dawson praised him, genuine admiration in his voice. "You've got your mother's gift." The pride in his tone made Abigail's heart swell. From the beginning, Dawson had valued her skills, seen them as equal to his own rather than secondary or merely decorative. That respect had formed the foundation of their marriage, allowing them both to grow in ways neither could have anticipated. Later that evening, with the children finally asleep after the excitement of their father's return, Abigail and Dawson sat together on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting comfortably against him. "I've been thinking," he said after a comfortable silence, "about expanding the house." "Oh," she looked up at him curiously, "add a wing to the east side, another bedroom or two, maybe a proper library." He paused, his fingers playing idly with a strand of her hair. "Room to grow." Abigail smiled, understanding his meaning immediately. "Is this your way of asking if I'd consider having another child, Dawson Valero? Maybe." He returned her smile, the lines at the corners of his eyes crinkling in the way she loved. "What do you think?" Is our family complete, or do we have room for one more little Valero? She pretended to consider this carefully. Well, Thomas is definitely your son, headstrong, fearless with the horses. And Emma, for all her caution, has your analytical mind. Perhaps we need one more to balance things out. Or two, Dawson suggested with exaggerated casualness. Twins run in my mother's family, you know. Abigail laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet ranch yard. Let's start with one and see how we fare. He pulled her closer, kissing her with the same passion that had always flared between them. I love you, Abigail Valero, more today than yesterday, less than tomorrow. And I love you, she whispered against his lips. My cowboy who caught me breaking his wild horse and ended up breaking every conventional expectation of what my life should be. No regrets, he asked, as he often did, though he knew the answer. Not a single one. She settled back against him, content in the life they had built together. Though I do sometimes wonder what would have happened if you hadn't caught me that morning. You would have broken midnight anyway, he said confidently, and found another way to append my carefully ordered existence. You think so? I know so. His voice grew serious. Some things are meant to be, Abigail. Some connections transcend chance and circumstance. I believe we would have found each other somehow, some way. The certainty in his words resonated with her own deepest convictions. Whatever paths they might have taken, whatever choices they might have made, their hearts would have recognized each other. Like midnight accepting her touch when he had rejected all others, Dawson and Abigail had recognized in each other a kindred spirit, wild yet gentle, strong yet vulnerable, independent yet longing for connection. As the night deepened around them, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky, they remained on the porch, talking quietly of plans for the ranch, for their children, for the life they continued to build together. And in the distance, Midnight and the other horses moved peacefully through the moonlit pastures, free yet protected, wild yet home, much like the hearts of the two people who had found in each other the perfect balance of freedom and belonging. In the end, perhaps that was the truest lesson Abigail had learned since that dawn encounter. That the wildest spirits don't need to be broken but understood. That the strongest connections are forged not through dominance but through respect. And that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most beautiful journeys of all.